And I get started now. So I've since forgotten the title of this talk because I submitted it months and months ago. But long story short, the main idea is the interesting hacks that I've done to get the performance of immersive railroading to where it is today. I posted a video, and I think the general chat was I had a server with 500 cars behind one locomotive, and this was just my desktop running the client at the same time. Again, it's a fairly powerful desktop. I think it's a i7, couple of years. 500 entities doing the path following that I have, and all the physics calculations that go along with it. It took quite a bit of engineering to tune it to that point. And I'm still talking with Player and a few others on improving the performance even more. So I've got a list. I'm going to start with audio hacks because those are actually kind of the simplest. As you've been walking around the convention, you've probably noticed that when the trains go flying by, especially if the whistle's going, you can hear a Doppler shift. Paul's code has a function. So behind the scenes, Paul's code is what Minecraft uses to play audio. I wasn't able to figure out how their Doppler shift calculations worked, so I ended up implementing my own logic on the client side. It takes the relative position and velocity of the player and compares that to the relative position and velocity of wherever the sound is being emitted from. This allows me to calculate different varieties of Doppler shift on the fly and tune it to exactly to tune it to feel exactly the way I think it should as far as real life. In addition, hacking the Paul's code audio system allows me to support larger audio distances, where you might hear a train coming 200 blocks away if you have it set up like that. You still have to have the entity loaded, but that's a whole other issue. It's also a bit more efficient. The amount of updates I do and the amount of audio I play is actually quite high. If you've ridden on the K4 and the outer loop train as it's going at top speed, you can still hear the individual chuffs from the pistons. You're using the standard Minecraft audio system, it just starts garbling together and cutting bits and pieces out. So by interacting with Paul's code directly, it allows me to be a little bit more, allows me to convince it to play more audio at the same time more efficiently. I've also pipelined my audio operations using there's a separate thread that gets set up, but I can send a bunch of commands at once instead of sending individual commands and interrupts to that. Stuff. That's one of the simpler hacks. Again, all this code is on GitHub, cam72cam/immersive railroading, if any of the mod authors want to take a look at any of the hacks that I'm going to talk about today. So now that we've covered audio, what is video hacks? Most of the locomotives you see are between 50 and 100 triangles. And I think the cars are usually anywhere between 10 and 50,000 triangles. I have them rendered is I stick, I create, I think 3 or 4 VBAs, one for normals and one for the actual points. And I render that all chunk, and I stick that rendering process inside of a display list. I know the more modern and professional way of doing this is you're supposed to upload everything to a VBO and render the VBO on the fly. However, VBAs inside of display lists have a little bit wider support. This has been more than adequate. I recently, just earlier today, had someone load I think it was a 500,000 triangle. I think they were loading a warship sitting on top of a train into immersive railroading just for fun. And I think he was on a i3 with integrated graphics. He was still getting 20 frames per second, which, considering the rendering that Minecraft does, is actually pretty efficient. In most cases, I try to bypass Minecraft's rendering system wherever possible. I'm not a huge fan of the way that Forge tries to force you to use the uh, odds structures. They're not efficient, and they also don't allow you to support the full object and MTL spec. One of the interesting things is you'll see the train on my head. That is just a plain item, though it is if this were a baked quad, it would be the performance would be absolutely abysmal. You would all be getting like 10 frames per second. What I ended up doing is all of my items return an empty list for baked quads. But whenever something asks for baked quads, it renders it does direct OpenGL calls inside of the get quads function, because it makes the assumption that anytime you're getting the quads, you already want to render the item, and you've already set up the proper context. And this is a little bit of an iffy assumption. I haven't found too many cases where it breaks things horribly. Oh yeah, so there's one person, I think it's from Warhammer. Someone has like a train that's just massive. That's what Calico's talking about. The other reason why I don't like baked quads is not just because of the performance, but if you look at the detail on these, you can see they're textured, and all of the objects in immersive railroading are just an object file and an MTL file. Unfortunately, with baked quads, you cannot support the full MTL spec. I've actually had this conversation with a bunch of modders when I was originally looking into rendering trains and doing things like this. I was built-in Forge's built-in object loader. The problem is when you with an MTL file and an OBJ file, the way that a lot of editors such as Blender, Maya, 3ds Max work is they repeat textures. So you've got one small sample for, let's say, part of the boiler, and that gets repeated 200-300 times. If you programs do is they take advantage of the fact that OpenGL allows repeating textures if you use multiples of the vertex of the texture coordinate. So if you have, let's say, texture coordinate of 13 by 13, or rather going from 0 to 0 to 13, 13, what it will do is it will repeat the texture from 0 to 1 on the fly, render it that way. You don't have to, it means that what you're shipping along with your game can be a lot smaller. You don't have to, as you're modeling, do that repeating yourself. The problem with this is Minecraft's texture atlas / sprite atlas system does not support this at all, and I wouldn't expect it to. If you think about that, you would have to on the fly break apart the model and rebuild it as you're trying to figure out how to render it, which would result in a lot more polys to actually cover that space. Because I kind of did a compromise. So what I do is I create a new texture sheet for every entity, or for every model. So for these 3 cars, which are identical, it's only using one texture sheet. But what ends up happening is I'm uploading the textures to the graphics card. What I do is I figure out the min and max texture coordinates that need to be uploaded. I do a little bit of math to see how small I can make that area, and then I upload that to the GPU. So there's one texture sheet for this whole model, and it's a texture sheet that's built with different size sprites on the fly that are calculated from the model. The performance of using a single texture sheet for rendering one of these, but at the same time support the full OBJ and MTL spec, which means that if you're creating models for immersive railroading, to example, put in through a resource pack, you can do it in theory from any 3D program out there, and you don't have to worry about, does Minecraft support the features? Am I going to need to import it into some other program and convert it? If it's an OBJ and MTL file, immersive railroading should support it out of the box. One of the trickier things I had to do, but using a single texture sheet inside of a display list is orders of magnitude faster than trying to switch texture sheets multiple times when drawing a model. Um, oh, the next thing I do is all of the parts. When someone adds a model to immersive railroading, all they need to do is name the parts correctly. So this right here is a smokebox piece. You can probably see this in my hand. Or let's see if I can get a better example. So this is a boiler component. The way that this is broken out is there's the group or object name in the MTL file is is what's read. So as I'm loading models, as I'm figuring out how pieces fit together, I'm iterating through and breaking up the model by the group name. And when I create the items, I do it based on the group name. So I've got these main rods. So if you're adding a model to the mod, pieces are named correctly and positioned correctly. You don't have to add new items. You don't have to do anything. That's all done on the fly, which I think is pretty neat. So we compared to some of the other railroading mods, and I hope they learn from the example I've tried to set, is that if you can life as easy as possible for modelers, their output will be significantly increased and improved. It also reduces the barrier to entry to get new people playing with the mod, playing with what you've built and extending it. I think that covers most of the video hacks I've done, and I know some of you were probably at my BTM talk last year, so some of that's probably repetitive. The next section is also a little bit repetitive, which is the network hacks. You've probably noticed that let me check the current TPS. TPS is it's actually 20, but it's been anywhere from 5 TPS all the way through 20 TPS. Trains, you'll have noticed that they tend not to be terribly affected by that. And what I've ended up doing is on the server side, the TPS is, and if the TPS is dropping, I'm actually skewing how far the trains are moving for every single tick. Last year when I gave the similar talk, what was happening is the server was telling the client what the average TPS was over the past 10, 20 ticks, and the client was skewing the movement based on that. So when the server would slow down, the client would fake slow itself down. It wasn't actually lagging anything. What it was doing, it was just skewing the points that it knows about. The way that immersive railroading works, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is instead of using the standard entity update method, which is very vulnerable to any sort of TPS drops or lags or packets being dropped, what I do is I calculate the movement in batches of, I think, 20 or 30, and I send that batch, and that reduces the amount of network overhead if you have a lot of cars. All the client's doing is stepping through that list of positions. If it knows the server's running slower, it can step through that list slower. It can skew. It can take an average between 2 points and skew it a certain amount, so that things are slowing down client side, but they aren't getting jerky in theory. This doesn't work as well for very erratic TPS, but if you have a very consistent drop, where let's say you're running at 15 TPS, 16 TPS consistently, the actually look pretty smooth, and the only thing you'll notice is it just doesn't feel like it's moving as fast. What's the advancement from last year is what I can do. What I realize server side is I can figure out that, oh, we're not ticking nearly as fast as we should be. So I can pretend that the locomotives are moving further than they actually are. What it allows me to do is when the TPS starts slowing down, I can still maintain the same speed with the trains, even though I'm calculating the same number of positions. I'm just skewing how far they move per each tick based on the guesstimated server speed. And that's what you've been seeing around as we've had lag spikes, as we've been having there. The trains have been fairly consistent. The biggest downside for this is that if you have a lot of trains running at the same time, if the TPS drops by half, you're effectively doing twice the work in the immersive railroading entity on update. If you're running a large map with hundreds of trains, can be a significant detraction to doing that. So it's a config setting server side, so you can flip it back and forth. You can either put you can either try and compensate server side, or you can just report to the client side. You think the server's running at this speed, and the server and you should try and guess based on that. So I'm not sure of any other mod that does that, and it served me pretty well with immersive railroading. Though the reason that I can do this is the entity positioning is very it's predictable. It's following a given path. If you're riding a horse, for example, and you're looking around and moving the horse, the gains down the drain really, really quickly. Stuff like if you know the entity's rough position within the next second or two, this reduces network traffic, reduces I was going to say there, but it's a lot more efficient. Okay, the next thing, which is also new, is, as MGR is demonstrating, the bounding boxes for all of the locomotives are calculated on the fly. This doesn't just mean that as it's going around a turn, it's turning the axis aligned bounding box. What it's doing is it's also it has a generated height map. So if you're watching when Minecraft started up, you can see there's a portion that says generating immersive railroading generating height maps. And what this means is each one of these parts has its own height map, and the bounding box, when it's calculated, and it caches this, so it's only doing this whenever you're modifying the parts that are actually sitting here. It allows you to do things like this. So I'm walking around this, and there's a hole here, and I'm going right through the bounding box. I have the way it's represented is a two-dimensional integer array, or double array, sorry, which has each part in it. And when it creates the bounding box and caches the bounding box, it attaches this information to it. And inside of my bounding box code, when it's trying to do the very fine-grained interactions, it's using Java geom to figure out if I am, or what's my relative position inside of the bounding box, and what is the height map at that position. And the really fun part is, as I start adding parts to this upward, so the bounding box is now regenerated for this piece right here. And I'll leave this up so you can play around with it. And it's a lot more accurate than I thought I could get it. This is what was one of the most requested features for quite a while, and it took me a bit to figure out exactly how this is calculated. What I end up doing when Minecraft is loading the files is I iterate through the object model that I have in memory. And if the component is bigger than a certain amount, so it won't calculate for something small like this whistle, but for the larger polygons, it'll calculate for that. It goes through each individual component and calculates the height map by using Java geometry again. And I've managed to get that relatively efficient. It's actually faster to calculate it than it is to read all the different pieces off a disk, which was surprising to me. Sum it apart again so people can play with that. I'm going to leave the firebox on. There we go. So after this is done, feel free to run around and play with this and see how good or bad my code is on this. Because it's Minecraft and because of the way that the bounding boxes work, it's not perfect. Like you can see right now, I'm hopping up and down a little bit because I'm close enough to one of the edges. May be able to tweak this a little bit better, but it's for what I'm looking to do at the moment. Oh, the next piece, as far as graphics and rendering models go, is you've noticed that as you look around, even though this entity crosses multiple chunks, it doesn't suffer from the entities disappearing when you're not when the chunk gets called. One of the optimizations that Forge has done in the latest Minecraft version is, or in the past couple Minecraft versions, is instead of checking all the loaded entities and checking their bounding boxes directly, the first thing it does is it checks which chunks you can render, and it only checks entities in those chunks. So if you have an entity that's large like this or even larger, and it's spanning multiple chunks, if you're looking at part of it, but the center of the entity is in another chunk that's not being rendered, your entity will not render. I actually have two different types of hacks inside my code to work around this. The first one, and this is the default one, is I actually spawn an entity that's sitting right in front of my face right now. And when that renders, it actually renders all of the track and all of the locomotives as part of that entity. So if you're ever looking in lag goggles or in the F3 menu and you see that immersive railroading magic entity, that's what that is. So by having an entity that's always rendered, it doesn't suffer from that. The alternative method is hooking into the world, and the post-render hooks allow you to render whatever you want after the rest of the world is rendered. This suffers from a few issues. Graphically, it doesn't fit in quite as well. It can run into some issues with lighting, and more importantly, excuse me, shaders. Shaders expect the last thing to be rendered to be clouds. So anything after that gets rendered really, really weird. If you're trying to render arbitrary stuff inside of the post-render hook. Default is using the magic entity, and works pretty well. But for some people, initially were reporting issues with it, so I left the old option in there, and it's not a huge amount of code because it's just calling the same function under the hood. That's if you're ever creating large entities for Minecraft and you see them glitching out and not rendering correctly, this works. This is how I ended up working around that. Next piece is resource packs. We have a very small selection. We've actually got a lower selection than ships with default immersive railroading. Player's exactly right. It needs global entities just like global testers. And again, anything like this can be abused, but for things where the one option, so the easiest option is working around the chunk calling issue versus trying to do an ASM hack and potentially break the entity renderer for everyone. And for large entities, that makes sense. Maybe for 1.13, I can suggest putting in a pull request for that. Let's see. Is big enough to force, yeah. So, but what I have now works really well. Once in a while it flashes, but it's a very, very small edge case, and I'm pretty happy with how it's working. The next piece is resource pack. So there's actually a hidden resource pack that's loaded right now in your clients, and that is it has a blacklist in it. So there's a JSON file, cam72cam immersive railroading blacklist.json, and you can specify locomotives and pieces of stock in there that should not be loaded into the game. So if you're running on a laptop with like 2 gigs of RAM and you still want to try and play this, you can blacklist half the stock or the stock that's heavier and just load a very basic set to play with. Conversely, all of immersive railroading's entities can actually be replaced or even added to in resource packs. So if you look at the CurseForge page, or you go to my Discord, or the Immersive Railroading Discord, and go to the resource packs channel, see just zip files that you drag in like any other resource pack, you activate them, and behind the scenes, Immersive Railroading does some on-the-fly, not adding of items, because all of my items are based in NBT, but it adds stuff to the static lists that represent what entities, what types of locomotives it knows about and what types of stock it knows about. So instead of having to recompile the mod or do something custom or adding a new user interface to add or remove stock, what I end up doing is just hacking on top of the resource pack system. That brings up the interesting thing where the resource pack system isn't implemented server side. On the server side is I have a folder for config in the config immersive railroading folder. Any zip file in there is treated like a resource pack, and because the server still needs to know about some of the properties like horsepower, the bounding box information, that sort of stuff. Same resource packs client and server side. Let's see. What other things did I want to go over? I think. Oh yeah, the one last hack on here, and it's going to look a little bit funny, but I'm walking around this entity. That's fairly simple. What I end up doing is I maintain a list of relative passenger positions, and when the player is hitting WASD and they're riding a locomotive, I send a special packet to the server that tells it to how to update the player's current position. This works both for players and for animals. The problem is animals don't. Rather, the positioning works for both players and animals. The problem is, and someone else might be smarter than me on this and have found a way around it. But when I try to get random animal entities, my stuff, the first one always works. Any after that doesn't, which is weird. So if you have, I was originally testing with a box car and a cow. I put one cow on there, everything works fine. Everything's functioning just as you'd expect. You add an additional cow, and they start glitching all over the place. It was very weird, and I wasn't able to figure out how that was supposed to be working under the hood. So what I ended up doing is it's similar to halfway between the old MFR Safari nets and the spawner renderers. So the way a spawner renders an entity, I'm using the same code behind the scenes to render any non-player entities that are mounted to immersive railroading stock. When I get the on-click event when you've got a leashed entity and you're clicking on a piece of stock, kills the entities, or it saves the entity's state, kills the entity, saves the entity's data to the data attached to the train car, the NBT there, syncs that with the client, and will render a fake version of those entities inside of each train car, which I think is pretty cool. That's, if you've seen the villagers riding around, that's exactly what's happening. Yeah, it probably does, because you're reducing the number of entities that you end up rendering. Or not render, updating. It's still the same render overhead. Let's see. I think that was everything I wanted to go over. I guess I'll open up the floor to questions now. MGR is waving his hands. Let's see. Have I missed any in the tier mode? Yep. I guess I can talk about some future hacks. One thing Player's been talking to me about, and Player is by far more of an expert than I am at optimizing stuff in Minecraft. And that probably even goes without saying. Immersive railroading has each one of the track pieces is its own tile entity. That's because when you put there's more data than you can fit in 16 bytes, or sorry, not 16 bytes, in 0 through 16 that goes in there. It needs the first thing is the position of its parent entity, or a parent tile. So there's one tile that stores all the information and renders, and then the rest of the tiles are just linked to that one. There's that data. There is information on my mind at the moment. There's information on augments on top of there, which allows for liquid loading and unloading. So ideally it would be a block, but yeah, and players suggesting that I switch those to non-ticking tile entities, which is probably a better idea. The problem is some of them still need to. They only do it when there's a train overhead. So I may be able to get around that lookup from the train instead of ticking the tile itself. I'll be playing around with that probably in a few months. I live, and I'm probably going to close Discord for the next month or so and just enjoy the summer. So, any other questions, comments, concerns? Yelling at me that I'm being an idiot in ways I'm abusing stuff. All of that is welcome. Let's see. Investigating throttling the entity in ABB queries. It's actually so. Players, there have you noticed the access line bounding box stuff taking up a lot of time in the NPS? Um, I think that's I've actually pulled up open the code because I was talking with player earlier. It looks like that happens every 20 ticks. No, sorry, 20. Sorry, every 5 seconds it checks, or if there's been a block update. If there's a block update, it checks, or if it stock nearby is the one that's. I could probably be more efficient with get stock nearby. Just find entities in a radius. Because I don't really even need to do an the full AABB check. I just need to do a is it within a certain distance. I'll make a note of that and try and optimize that in one of the next updates. That is possible. I've seen some mods that take that approach. So there's that direction. There's the type of I'm trying to think about all the data. So in addition to storing that information, I'd probably still keep them a non-ticking tile, primarily because some of them have inventories. So the fluid loader and the item loader have an inventory internally. For anything, for any piece of track that doesn't have that, it's just set to null. But as soon as you stick one of those augments on it, creates a tanker, it creates a item container object. Yeah. Let's see. Most fun derp. That's a good question. So I think the most fun derps I have is with physics, because if I flip a sign in the wrong spot, I can get the locomotives going at I think the record is 100 times Mach speed, or Mach 100. Interestingly enough, the code actually takes into account. So you're actually getting into small percentages of the speed of light at that speed. If especially when you're dealing with when I think when I was doing the initial coupling code, when you have two sets of entities moving at their own relative speeds, when they couple together, you want to take the average speed. I flipped something really weird. I flipped one of the signs somewhere, and it shot off at pretty much as fast as it could go. But on that note, Friedrich, who's you may have seen around, Friedrich LP, he's been helping me, and he's the mod while I'm taking a break. Around with some of the settings, and he realized that you can set the slope multiplier, how much a slope impacts a train going over it. It's a realism setting. You can set that to a really large negative number. So when the train goes over that's when it shoots it off at about 10 times light speed. Sorry, 100 times light speed. And he's actually got a video of it running. That's his client's not keeping up with it. The server's keeping up. It's just flashing in and out of existence, going around the circle, which is pretty fun. He was talking about for the RC he designed moving away from the world to a more abstract representation. No blocks, but a graph for the connections. Harsh being a point on the graph edge. Interesting. Hmm. That's a decent idea. Um, my track calculate my physics code is fairly messy at this point, which gives me a chance to plug track API. If anyone wants to build a mod that interacts with the tracks in a generic way, I've talked to probably a few of you before about this. Is instead of having to import immersive railroading into your IDE and dealing with that and dealing with dependencies there and doing optional mod checking, if you depend on Track API, it's a very simple library that all it's doing saying, hey, I'm at this point, I'm moving in this direction at this magnitude. What's my next position on track? It's the simplest abstraction I could come up with for moving an entity on a path. What that means is if you wanted to, say, write your own train mod, but you don't, you make your own track system, but you want to add compatibility with immersive railroading. So let's say people could have both of these. You could have both of these. There, having the entities coupled would be a little bit much, but having them run on the same infrastructure would be easier on the players. So just plugging track API, it's a simple thing you could depend on if you're interested. Just make a simple call to figure out how the track gets followed. Okay. Also, just going back to what players said there, the other problem is that I have the way that the stations function is there's a speed retarder, which in real life is something that clamps around the wheels of the train car and drags on it as it's moving across. So it's kind of like a external brake pad that's hooked onto the rails. And so when you give that power, or in Minecraft, you give it a redstone signal, it applies a certain amount of braking force. So that does add some complications. All food for thought. Okay, well, are there any other questions? Yeah, Blair, I may actually end up reaching out to you later on at some point in the next couple of months. I want to figure out how to do electric trains, and the problem is I don't want to keep all the tracks loaded when they're sending power. I want to be able to have. I want to build some sort of graph that gets modified when you place down track or update track. Figure out how to build that in an efficient way that doesn't require having the intermediary chunks loaded, but will still take into account when tracks break inside of an island of unloaded chunks and how all that fits together. And then I'll probably reach out in a couple Discord channels for help. Any non-IO related questions? Well, I think that's it for today. Thanks for coming, and thanks for your feedback.